The History of Castlebar podcast is sponsored by mayobooks.ie.
Hello and welcome to the History of Castlebar podcast. I'm John Healy.
And I'm Noel Campbell.
Each week we'll be discussing a selected chapter from our book, The History of Castlebar, which is available online from mayobooks.ie or in-store in the Castle Bookshop. Noel, this week you'll be introducing your own chapter on sport.
Yeah, John, it's such a wide topic to be discussed, and it actually took up 2 chapters in the book when all was said and done. And there was much debating about what sports could go in, and we could have written a full book really on sport. Just this evening I'd like to talk a wee bit about maybe the Mitchells and some of the sports that were quite popular and very active, we'd say, in Castlebar, you know, going back really to the 1700s and just what happened to them over the years.
Well, I suppose, as you said there, the most popular sport in Castlebar today is probably Gaelic football. So what were the origins of the Mitchells, the Castlebar Mitchells?
Well, they have quite a long history in the town, going right back to really the foundation of the establishment of the Gaelic Athletic Association, the GA, in 1884. And of course, the GA was set up to promote indigenous sport. You know, we're talking about revival in cultural nationalism at the time. And the leaders in nationalism, one of them, a Ballina man, a Bal man, P. of course, was instrumental in setting up the GA with Cusack in 1884, and really this was going to be the promotion of all things Irish. At the time, there was a big promotion, of course, in the Irish language, Irish theatre, and of course sport was inevitable. Plenty of young fellas and young women were playing sports, so it was decided they were going to take a more control of those sports and put a code to them and rules to them, and really trying to govern the sport, I suppose, as well. And you know, there's always underlying reasons for these, and I suppose maybe a bit of control of what young men's pastimes were as well was needed, because of plenty of people at the time, we'll say in the IRB and that, saw a future where young men, fit and able, would be called upon, of course, to fight British occupation, as they saw it. So in 1884, the GA is set up. It's quite slow to take hold across the country, and you could imagine its correspondence and travel, etc., must have had an effect on how quickly it would have spread. Certain areas where interest is there, or maybe the sports of hurling and football were quite active, took it on more readily than other areas. In the early years of the GA, actually, football wasn't one of their preferred sports at all. The GA were really promoting hurling as a more manly sport, and hurling was given precedence really over football. So football clubs took a long while to establish themselves, but they did establish themselves, and they established themselves right across the island, actually. So in 1885, a meeting organised in December of that year to form a football club, simply noted as a football club in Castlebar, is recorded really by the Mitchells and their centenary book as the foundation of the Castlebar Mitchells GA Club. You know, in researching this book, I did go to the GA Museum and the County Board and Castlebar Mitchells as well, all very helpful in supplying information where they could. But you can't beat the newspaper reports at the time, and I went back to have a look at the newspaper reports from 1885 just to see exactly what were the origins of the Mitchells Club at the time. So that the December 1885 article actually talks about a football club being established. It's going to be called the Castlebar Football Club, and its first game is set for January 1886. So within a matter of weeks, they're going to meet and take on the 14th Regiment of the British Army, which were stationed in Castlebar at the time. So, I mean, in my own head, I was thinking, well, that's unusual. You have a very Irish nationalist organisation pallying up almost to the British Regiment in the town. I don't think the British Regiment possibly would want to have much of a relationship with the Gaelic Athletic Association and what they stood for. But so I decided just to delve into that a bit more and read a report from that actual match report. And, you know, at the time, how will we say it, very minor events got a lot of text in papers. You know, papers, of course, were probably not as big as they are now, but the text was tiny. There was no adverts really. There was no pictures, of course, so it was text heavy. You know, these papers were text heavy. So there's actually a great full report about the January 1886 game, and I'll just touch on that in a minute. But the founding members of the Castlebar Football Club, which were noted in 1885, they also piqued my interest as well, because a lot of them were quite obviously, we'll say non-native names, if we can say that, De Exeter Jordan and Knott and Pullen and certain names. And I thought, okay, that's straight away I was thinking, well, there must be something to this as well. Anyways, in the January 1886, it was quite a massive game. They played it down in Pigeon Park. The Castlebar football team take on the 14th Regiment. There's hundreds of people turn up to watch it. So this is quite a novelty. So we know something new was being played here, something, probably not seen before. 2 founding members actually of the Castlebar Football Club, they were actually members of the British Army at the time. So they end up playing on the day for the 14th Regiment in Pigeon Park, playing against the club they had founded. Right. So there was British Army personnel were founding members of the Castlebar Football Club. So I thought that possibly a bit unusual for a nationalist organisation as well. Anyways, the match report goes on. It's quite detailed, and I'll just read a bit out because to fans of certain sports it might sound very familiar. It reads, as De Exeter Jordan dropped out from the 25-yard posts, the forwards following up hard smothered the military reply, and scrummaging took place near the 25, out of which Rutledge got possession for Castlebar, and running through the opposing backs amidst great applause gained a try, while Allshire converted into a goal. Rutledge scored 2 more tries in the second half, and Allshire successfully kicked both goals before the end of the game. The military were kept scoreless. So I know, and I think, it's accepted that when Gaelic games started, there was different variations of Gaelic football and hurling played across the country, and there was really, some teams were massive with 20 a side and some had, so there was really part of the GA's reason for setting up was to try and bring everyone under the one set of rules. So we know that didn't happen really for a while. Clubs and our local areas like to hold on to their own, and scrummaging and certain rough play was allowed in early Gaelic football. But certainly they mention in this match report of the football club's first activities with tries, conversions and scrums.
That would hardly lead you to...
Well, to me it points to a rugby club, a rugby club being formed.
Right. And no mention of goals and points, of course.
No mention of goals and points. Of course, in early GAA there was no points. You had 4 upright sticks. You had the middle one that we would call a goal now wouldn't have had a crossbar. If you think of Australian rules, actually, that's the setup we had. So you had lesser points for scoring in the two outer zones. Yeah. Okay. So that was Gaelic football in the early days. But I thought, okay, well, to me now, that as a rugby fan, that said rugby all over.
Right.
So as I said before, the names had interested me as well. De Exeter Jordan, William De Exeter Jordan was the first chairman of the Castlebar Football Club. So I went on a wee scouting mission to see what I could find out about William. So he was, and he's mentioned obviously as playing that day as well. I found he died quite a young man in his 30s. He was a doctor. He was known, familiar. Everyone loved him. He was known as Dr. Willie, in fact, and that's what he's noted as in the papers. Yeah. Okay. But he died a young man in his 30s. His obituary in 1889 goes to great lengths to mention his captaincy of Castlebar Rugby Football Club. But there's no mention of the GA or Gaelic games at all. And the obituary is actually printed slightly different ones in different papers. But there's no mention of the GA or Mitchell's in his obituary, which I thought, for a man who would have established it, you imagine they'd be singing his praises on his death, that he would have been part of this massive movement in Irish nationalism. There are a lot of things, and I mean, I mentioned in the book, I say what was formed in 1885 is debatable. I suppose it still is, but I think... to my mind, we know clubs didn't set up immediately after 1884 when the GA was established. Clubs took a long time, and you had to be affiliated as well. It wasn't just a matter of a group of lads getting together and forming a club. There was a formal procedure. Absolutely, you had to get together and affiliate, go to the county board and get permission to set up. And there was a big problem in getting affiliated, because plenty of clubs, and actually in Castlebar itself, the Mitchells do set up, and they, in their early years, whenever they were formed, we'll say, they weren't called the Mitchells straight away. And Sean Rice covers this in the centenary book that the Mitchells produced as well. So they weren't called the Mitchells straight away, so which doesn't make research any easier. But they're eventually set up. But by the early 1900s, there's another club set up in Castlebar, the Castlebar Douglas Hydes GA Club. So there's 2 GA clubs operating in Castlebar, in quite a small town.
The original Castlebar Football Club and...
Well, they're the Mitchells now at this stage.
The Mitchells are still there,
and they're being called the Castlebar Mitchells in the early 1900s. So they're quite identifiable in the records. And then the Castlebar Douglas Hydes GA Club are also set up. And the two clubs seem to be getting on, and there might be enough of a population for the two of them to survive. There was also a separate club, was the Castlebar Mitchells Hurling Club as well at the time, dealing obviously specifically with hurling. But it's in 1913, a new club establishes itself, or at least tries to. They're called the Castlebar Commercials, and they try to establish themselves as a GA club as well. So there's three clubs now kind of vying for membership, which is quite tough for any club to survive. But anyways, this doesn't go down well, of course, with Mitchells, and if the Douglas Hydes Club were still surviving at that stage, it didn't go down well with them. But I think it came from the Commercials were a threat, obviously, to membership of Mitchells. But I read in one report where it was very much down to kind of a personal. Some man got a gripe with Mitchells and something didn't go his way, so he took his ball and he went home and he set up his own Castlebar Commercials. Right. But they were based, and I could be corrected on this, I think they were based from staff in the bacon factory, or at least one of the industries that were operating at the time. I think that's where the Commercials came from. And it was Castlebar Commercials, and the man who decides he's going to set it up, a few of them set it up, they apply to be affiliated with the county board and they're turned down. So that's the end of the commercial.
That's the end of the story.
So at that stage, then the Mitchells have free reign and they have access to the town for membership, and they go on from strength to strength.
And the Douglas Hyde has gone at that stage.
The Douglas Hyde, hard to keep a track on them, but certainly they did exist at the same time as the Mitchells at one stage, but there doesn't seem to be any acrimony between them. There seemed to be enough in the pot for the two of them to eat out of.
Okay. Just to move away from the GA for a minute, Noel, was Castlebar known for any sports, we'll say, that thrived, we'll say, in the early or down to the century and are no longer in existence? Was there anything? Yeah,
there was several actually, but two of the main ones would be the horse race and the Castlebar horse races that went on in Castlebar were a massive event. The earliest records I could get for the horse racing, a week-long event of racing. I mean, that's quite an event to pull off. Earliest records I could find was back to 1740s, where there are advertisements for the Castlebar races, and really they're pitched in the papers, national papers as well now. So you can imagine the attraction. 1740s, people are travelling from across the island to get to the Castlebar races. For a week. And you can imagine the draw, I don't know, the size of Castlebar in the 1740s, but everywhere would have been booked out. This was a massive event, and if you're travelling that distance, you're staying for the week, I presume. You're not going for the night and back for a 3-day trip to Tullamore or wherever you're from. But those races were advertised really well, and there was a big draw on them. At that stage, there were the patrons of it were, as there would be later, the Earls of Lucan. And the kind of the gentry of the town. Yeah, it was really a class-conscious sport at the time. Up until the 1880s, that racing did quite well. There was times, of course, like every sports, where their fortunes disappeared, and it's kind of largely on personalities as well. If somebody decided they weren't going to put in as much energy, or somebody passed on, it dropped for a couple of decades even at some stages. But in the 1880s, there was a call to revive the races again. So we can tell at that stage that it might have been gone, for 20 or 30 years possibly. So the races are revived. They were the Brafey races, the Castlebar races that was ran on a course out in Brafey. And when they're revived in the 1880s, Lord Lucan provides land on the Ballinrobe Road out in Ahadrina, quite a large area actually. And if anyone goes onto the Ordnance Survey maps that are available online, osi.ie, you can see the courses lined out on the Ballinrobe Road. We'll say where that storage business is now. Yes. It was right on that.
On the right side,
if you find that on a map and overlay the older 1840s maps on it, or the later 1900s maps, you'll find that race course and a shooting range in the middle of it. But he'd given out quite a lot of, and it wasn't just a matter of finding land. You had to level it. You had to make sure, this was it was called the Ahadrina steeplechases. And again, it was a massive event in the town. The businesses were all behind it, of course, because they were doing well out of it. They had, there was entertainment put on every night in hotels, Sheridan's hotels, special meals put on at set times to coincide with the end of the races. So you didn't have to, you could comfortably attend the races and know that when you got back to your hotel room, you were sitting for dinner at 7 and there was a dance in the town hall and wherever it be afterwards. Yeah. So full entertainment. The town made great hay out of that. That didn't last. The Ahadrina steeplechases went on for about 20, 30 years. So by the early 1900s, the whole racecourse was disused, actually. It was gone. And at that stage, the businesses in the town said, we've missed something big here. We can't let it go. So the UTC get involved. and they decide to push for a publicly owned racecourse that the UDC in the town would manage. So they get back onto Lucan again, and they got in experts. They were quite savvy, and they knew. There was a lot of racing going on at the time. There was races in Kilmaine, there was races in the north of the county, there was races all over Mayo. So we're competing with every other town in Mayo, not alone the country. There was always competition to get the best runners from the Curragh. Whoever won the best cups in the Curragh races, you had to try and get them down. And we actually, at some stage, some of the races in the Ahadraina steeplechases were confined only to people who ran, to jockeys who had competed in the Curragh. So it was always trying to get the best. Okay. And of course they wanted to come down because there was a bit of, they were the races, these were the main races in the country, they were the top flight, and the big prizes, and the top flight were racing against. So you mentioned the prizes. Actually, it was quite interesting. We'll call them the elite of the town, the Lucans and their brethren in the Church of Ireland, and the bigger businesses were putting up the money for the prizes. So they were putting up the cups and the money that went with it. Castlebar Corporation got involved as well back in the 1700s when it was, really at one of its heights. The Castlebar Corporation got involved, and they were promoting prizes and putting money forward to it as well. So it was you could imagine Mayo County Council now promoting horse racing of that size. It was quite serious events. But the UDC get involved. They find it very hard. They're going into the war years. It's very hard to get Lucan to commit to anything at that stage as well, even though he was in favour of it. Building materials not available. We're into the Great War. Lucan decides, he says, you have to adhere to the conditions I've put on this. If I'm giving you the lawn or area around the lawn, you have to have a grandstand and turnstiles. And they says, listen, we don't have the money for this, and we don't have the building material, so it doesn't happen, and it stops for a long time. There's no action. In 1923, then the first race in about 20 years takes place, but it takes place in a place called Milltown. I think I have it in the book. But by the 1940s, they're running over the aerodrome field, as it's called.
On the Refuge Road.
So they're racing it out there. But sadly, the races, any account of the races, it kind of quietly disappears then after that. It's quite a sad, massive event for a week. You can imagine the draw on the town.
Like Cheltenham now.
It was huge. The best runners from the Curragh, they were actively seeking them and making races that would attract them. They weren't going to be racing against, Noel Campbell down in Castlebar, who happened to have a good-looking horse. They wanted to race against jockeys of their calibre, and you had to get them down, but you also had to have, the kind of power and money behind it to attract them as well. So it was great to be running for the Earl of Lucan's Cup, and it was great to be running for the Castlebar Corporation Cup. So great event. Another great sporting event that is gone, and it was the regattas that were carried out on Lough Lannagh.
Lough Lannagh. Yeah.
Again, it was kind of a class-based activity. But in the mid 1800s, there was a Lough Lannagh regatta that was being advertised in the papers, and it was a seriously run, and hotly contested regatta. It went on. We're talking major boats. It went from oar boats, road boats, maybe 4 oar boats, to yawls. So you're talking sailboats. And yawls can be up to 20 foot, and with their sails, accompanying sails, so they're quite a size. But the way they ran a course from Lough Lannagh up to Rahens, about a 5k course, massive crowds at it. One thing that I thought that was very funny that I read about it was, this was the great and the good of the town were meeting up to enjoy their day.
Yes, it was the nobility of that.
Yeah. And somebody was sailing with Lord Lucan's silks, and this was great, for your honour, my dear, But the lads, the folk in town used to use the occasion to run their own races on either side of the lake. And this used to drive Lucan insane, because I'd imagine they were racing and there was money on it, I'm sure, and while the crowd was there, they were trying to make their own bit of fun and sport out of it as well. But there was complaints, of course, from the Earl that this is not for you. This is not your day. But the Lucan, of course, begins to reside more and more in England, and really he was the kind of driving force behind the Lough Lannagh regatta, and it disappeared. But regatta comes back in early 1900s. The Castlebar branch of the Foresters, the Irish National Foresters, a kind of fraternal body, they set one up, but it's more of a family day, and it's more geared to
more democratic,
the majority of the town. And there's swimming competitions and water polo competitions, and you wouldn't have seen any of this near the during Lucan's time. But right up to 70s, John, there was the Mayo Sailing Yacht Club had dinghy sailing races on Lough Lannagh as well, and we used and right up to today it was great. We have the stand up paddle boarding and
That's right, it's back in use.
I was up there the last day, and they're back out the ATU there at the campus, quite active on it as well. It's great to see some activity at last.
But I suppose, Noel, it shows that the landed gentry had a lot to do with the sporting activities.
They really did,
in the town,
it wasn't just the sailing or the horse racing. I mean, the rugby was very much, it was the regiment sport, and the officers got very involved. Yes. Tennis was very much intertwined with the Church of Ireland, and whichever reverend and canon was in the town in the early 1900s, there was a Reverend William Taylor. He was very instrumental in establishing tennis in the town. And the same with golf. He was a golfer, and he had a hand in forming the first golf club in town. He passed away in 1904, about the time that the first golf club was being established, the first course at least was being established.
So they were garrison sports, really, a lot of them.
They really were. And, within a short period of time, they became very popular among the public.
Well, Noel, thanks very much. It's a very all-embracing subject, and I'm sure there's a lot more to be read in the chapters in the book. Thank you. Before we go to the ad break, we'll take a look at an ad from the past. Noel, you've been looking for some past ads. You have something of interest.
I have an interesting one from the Connacht Telegraph from 1904, the early 1900s, and it was from a business on what's now Main Street. It was Bridge Street, of course, at the time, and we've noted in the book how busy that Market Street thoroughfare was. But there's almost like a warning here in an ad to tell people to come in and shop early, and it's crafty in its own way. We are sorry we could not serve you on Saturday. Try to come sometime during the week when we're not so busy. Horan's the Bridge, Castlebar. Nice and frank.
Nice and subtle.
Brendan Gummerton Video and Photography, New Antrim Street, Castlebar. With state-of-the-art equipment and a keen eye for detail, we bring your vision to life. From corporate events to family portraits, we ensure every shot is stunning and memorable. Call now at 087 746 0121 to schedule your consultation. Brendan Gummerton Video and Photography, New Antrim Street, Castlebar.
Well, at this stage, we'd like to invite our listeners to submit any comments or questions you may have to historyofcastlebar@gmail.com. And Noel and myself will do what we can to answer and discuss what you want to ask about. Today we have a question from Angela, and her question is, have any changes been made in the names of the streets over the years? And I think there were some changes, Noel, were there? Or attempted changes, maybe? There
were plenty. It's always a question that comes up as to, how did the name stay after all this time and all the births and rebirths of nationalism, etc., etc. But they stuck, and they stuck because the people of the town used them. And that's basically why they did stick. But there was a very, we'll say, powerful campaign maybe in 1920 to change the street names, and it was a motion brought to Castlebar UDC by one of the councillors, and he suggested, based on our connections to Irish nationalism and the whole history of the country, that pretty much all the street names would be changed. So certain names, I'll just give you some examples. Bridge Street was going to be called Teeling Street, and Ellison Street was to be John MacBride Street. Right. These were all to be very, very nationalist names. Market Street was to be Humbert Street, and Stawball was going to be French Hill Street. So a lot of these, and actually at the time while the council passed the motion and said this was going to be, up on 20 street names were going to be changed, it didn't happen. So a committee was set up to reinvestigate these street names, and they weren't actually proposals, they were passed at the time, so they were to be changed.
Officially
officially they had been changed, but even in the minute books of the council, they didn't change. They were still using the old names. So officialdom were sticking to the original names.
Right.
Some names weren't going to be changed because they felt they were steeped in history already, like Gallows Hill wasn't going to change, and one or two others in the town. Rush Street, funnily enough.
And Rush Street.
Yeah, even though they couldn't point to the historical significance of the name. And it's still up for debate. I've heard different reasons of where Rush Street came from, and one connected to 1798, but we doubt that. But anyways, all the changes were approved by the committee, and the new roads at Davitt's Terrace. These were new streets at the time. It was to be called Davitt's Terrace and Ash's Terrace. So I've yet to figure out where Ash's Terrace was. It never caught on with the townspeople. The street names never came into popular use. Officialdom and the council didn't use them. So in 1938, Councillor J.J. Collins brings a motion back to the council and is seconded by a colleague. And it's proposed that the street names go ahead again, that they be changed. And this is almost 20 years later. But of course, we know we're living in town today. The street names never changed. And, they're very much rooted in the British connection to our history.
So virtually none of them changed. None of the new names.
None of them changed. The only names that, absolutely, none of them changed. And there was, as I said, 20 at least of the streets were to be renamed and never did. Now, streets over the years did change. I mean, Collector's Lane was Lucan Street. That was in connection to the toll collector of Castlebar Corporation. It was a roll, and supposedly there was a toll at the further end of Collector's Lane. So if you were coming in on market day with your produce, you were paid your dues there. Somebody had to look at what you were carrying and paid your dues. That became Lucan Street, of course. There was a little known street that I found reference to in one of the newspapers at the top of Spencer Street, say going out of town, just on the bend as you go on to, it would be Station Road, was referred to as Lennox Street in one newspaper report I read, and I was puzzled as to where that came from, Lennox Street, but it was identified into that corner because there were certain properties there related to the British regiments in the town. But it came from the 4th Earl of Lucan. Charles Brigham had actually married a lady called Lady Cecilia Catherine Gordon Lennox, and she was the daughter of the Duke of Richmond. So I suppose in honour of his new family, he had named this partial street Lennox Street. And one reference I only found, and that never caught on. He named Duke Street, I understand, after the father-in-law. So the Duke of Richmond got himself a street, which was Duke Street.
But that stuck all right.
That stuck all right, yeah.
But Lennox...
Yeah, and I mean, some streets don't really, you wouldn't hear much use of them, I suppose, now as well. Shamble Street. Certain people wouldn't pick it out driving through the town. But Castle Street was Castle Lane, I think, John, was that?
Castle Lane is right, yes.
It's interesting as well, something that came up with, in my own research from dealing with the council was the Orson Conde's Damal. And I was wondering what's the Irish for Damal. It's on Meal. I don't know if the pronunciation is right, but M-E-A-L. And I thought, well, that sounds like a fabrication. Possibly not. And of course, there's a name on the green already, and if anyone looks at the courthouse, if you're standing in front of the courthouse and look about 20 feet up, there's a plaque with the original name of the green in English and Irish. And I thought, we know the names of the green was the actual plain area, the green area, and the Mall was the walk from the old boxing club to
right across
the Church of Ireland, and that was the Mall. So really, Orson Conde isn't on the Mall, it's actually on the green. And you'd wonder if the address should reflect that and go back to the actual instead of on this Irish name that I've not heard of.
Well, thanks for that, Noel. That sort of answers the question that there were no changes, no matter what the officialdom thought or what the councillors thought.
The people
Things
spoke.
never changed. The people spoke. Well, thank you, listeners, for joining us today. Please join us again next week. And just a reminder that the book called The History of Castlebar can be bought online at mayobooks.ie or in store in the Castlebar bookshop. So from me, John Healy.
And from me, Noel, good evening.
Thank you indeed.
The History of Castlebar podcast is sponsored by mayobooks.ie. The series is produced by me, Brendan Gilmartin. If you enjoyed the show, please tell a friend and leave a review.